Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's keep week 60 going with today's Tolkien Tuesday. Now, for this series, we've gone back to the revised and expanded letters volume, and last week we began what looks to be an extended look at the famous letter number 210 to talk about Tolkien and adaptations. Discovered it's going to take a lot more than 2 weeks to walk through it. Let's see how far we get through the red ink and frustration this week. Now, we'd finished last week after talking about the approach Zimmerman had taken with Tom Bombadil and Goldberry. Tolkien not being a fan of either, as Zimmerman completely misrepresented Tom Bombadil and botches Goldberry so badly that Tolkien said he'd rather she disappear than make a meaningless appearance. Well, Tolkien's next complaint has to do with the Hobbit's arrival at the Prancing Pony Inn, where he writes, "The landlord does not ask Frodo to register. Why should he? There are no police and no government. Neither do I make him number his rooms. If details are to be added to an already crowded picture, they should at least fit the world described." You know, that's really the problem here, isn't it? It's not that there's some slight change. I mean, really, having Bartleman ask Frodo to check in at the hotel, that doesn't seem like a big deal, but it's that the change itself doesn't fit the world described. And this comes back to the second element of that Shippey test we talked about last week. Tolkien arguing that where adaptations fail is typically in exaggeration and in the intrusion of unwarranted matter. But if you think Tolkien's complaint about that is maybe just a bit too pedantic, his next one is completely justified, and it shows, honestly, just how little Zimmerman had been paying attention. Tolkien argues that having Strider and the hobbits leave the inn at night, running off into the dark, is the last thing that Aragorn would have done. It is based on a misconception of the Black Riders throughout, which I beg Zimmerman to reconsider. Their peril is almost entirely due to the unreasoning fear which they inspire, like ghosts. They have no great physical power against the fearless. But what they have, and the fear that they inspire, is enormously increased in darkness. Well, of course. I mean, this totally tracks with everything we read in the text, and it does suggest that Zimmerman has really missed an obvious point about the nature of the Nazgul. Now, Tolkien wasn't happy, well, with a lot of things, but with what Strider and the hobbits could see from the top of Weathertop, the Valley of Rivendell. Tolkien has to point out it was not a shimmering forest, before pointing out that Zimmerman seems to have anticipated Lorien, a place that Tolkien reminds him it in no way resembled. And clearly Rivendell could not be seen from Weathertop, Tolkien explains. It was 200 miles away and hidden in a ravine. I can see no pictorial or story-making gain in needlessly contracting the geography. In other words, Tolkien is arguing this is not a change that's needed due to the change in medium. It does not improve the film cinematically to have Rivendell visible from Weathertop. And we're so not done with Weathertop. Tolkien writes, Strider does not whip out a sword in the book. Naturally not. His sword was broken. Why then make him do so here, in a contest that was explicitly not fought with weapons? More than that, Tolkien points out, Zimmerman's decision to use the elvish light for Aragorn's sword is another false anticipation, one of Zimmerman's chief faults. Now, just as we somewhat unexpectedly spent a lot of time on Weathertop yesterday, we find that Tolkien just can't leave that hill quite yet, saying, Aragorn did not sing the Song of Gil-galad. Naturally, it was quite inappropriate since it told of the defeat of the Elven King by the enemy. Now, as you all know, from Week 55's Third Age Thursday, when we covered that song, it was Sam who recited a few verses of it, not Strider. It wasn't the time or place, and he knew it. Tolkien adds a few other complaints. What do you expect? The Black Riders do not scream, but keep a more terrifying silence. Aragorn does not blanch. The riders draw slowly in on foot in darkness and do not spur. There is no fight. Sam does not sink his blade into the ring-wraith's thigh, nor does his thrust save Frodo's life. And that's the end of this list of complaints. After all, if Sam had managed to stab the ring-wraith, recall that he was wielding a sword of Westernesse, we'd have seen a preview of what happened when Merry stabs the Witch King on the Pelennor. The ring-wraith would have fallen, and the sword would have disintegrated. Now, Tolkien seems to have had it. Asking you could just sense the frustration. He says, why has my account been entirely rewritten here with disregard for the rest of the tale? I can see that there are certain difficulties in representing a dark scene, but they are not insuperable. A scene of gloom lit by a small red fire with the wraiths slowly approaching as darker shadows until the moment when Frodo puts on the ring and the king steps forward revealed. would seem to me far more impressive than yet one more scene of screams and rather meaningless slashings. Honestly, I'd like to see Tolkien write a screenplay here. He'd come closer than anybody else, I imagine. Finally, the professor acknowledges that he's torn this particular Weathertop scene apart more thoroughly than others, saying that he's done so to show an example of two things that he's found really frustrating. First, deliberate alteration of the story in fact and significance without any practical or artistic object. And then his second complaint is that the flattening effect that assimilation of one incident to another must have. Wow. These are some deep criticisms and they make a lot of sense. But let's hit one more scene before we wrap up for the week, the departure from Rivendell. Now, the published version of the letter goes from Weathertop's complaints listed as number 11 to this one at number 15. And I'm just dying to know what 12, 13, and 14 were. But even in the extended edition of the letters, they're not there. Tolkien complains that once more, time has been contracted and hurried, and that this has resulted in a reduction of the importance of the quest. Gandalf does not say they will leave as soon as they can pack, Tolkien writes. 2 months elapse. There is no need to say anything with a time purport. Tolkien, once again, coming back to the importance of seasons and the passage of time, he ends up suggesting to Zimmerman that simply a change in the scenery to winter would be enough here. We'll get to yet another Rivendell departure moment and the inappropriate appearance of the eagles to start next week. For now, though, this wraps up this week's Tolkien Tuesday. Be sure to join me again next week for more Letters from Tolkien. In the meantime, please visit patreon.com/TolkienTimes to learn how you can join my content council and be a part of deciding what I talk about next series. You also can support the show, get an ad-free feed, and a bonus episode every week. Join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Word Nerd Wednesday. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Please follow or subscribe in your podcast apps and follow @Tolkien Times on social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.